Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Avdiivka section of the front line where the Russians are flanking Novoselivka Persha from the rear along the Vovcha river line. Following the capture of Sokil and Voshchod, the Russians have continued along the river line and are flanking the supply lines of Novoselivka Persha from the west. This is following the fact that the Russians have captured the supply line to the north, and capturing the fortified positions here west of Novoselivka Persha would completely cut off the town from all supplies. The Russians actually have now managed to cut off with physical direct fire and control here to the north and northwest of Novoselivka Persha all its supply lines. There are two supply lines left, which is this one to the northwest and this one to the west directly by the fortified positions. The northern road is at such close proximity to the Russian positions that the Russians now have direct fire control of the road. At the same time, the southern one is not really that far from the Russian positions. If the Russians push onwards, manage to cross over and capture this fortified position west of Novoselivka Persha, they will have direct fire control over the final road, and Novoselivka Persha will be operationally encircled and almost completely physically cut off. If they move further down and capture the next fortified position, Novoselivka Persha would be completely physically cut off from all supplies to and from the town. This combined with the Russian positions all across the northern, eastern and southeastern parts mean that the Ukrainian positions by the town are very vulnerable. It is likely that the Ukrainians will do one of two things. Either they will launch a counterattack to the north where they'll look to limit the Russian advances and secure their own supply lines by strengthening their positions, or they will simply send reinforcements to try and hold the current situation and then slowly push the Russians back to secure their positions. The Russians will be looking to push onwards to the next fortified positions, getting control over both of them, which will significantly strengthen their positions here by Novoselivka Persha. And then they will use that advantage to capture Novoselivka Persha and move on to the Vovcha river line, aligning the entire front line with the river line here in this section of the front line. This will allow the Russians to then move on to the next positions by attacking village after village, position after position, getting control over the fortified areas, and moving along the railway line to advance through it and along it towards Pokrovsk. This is a combined assault by the Russians both here to the west of Avdiivka along the railway line, to align the front line by the river line, and then move on to Pokrovsk. And then there's also the flank here to the north towards the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. We also see that the Russians are slowly pushing along the east of Losovatske. The objective here of the Russians is to gain control over the southern bank of the river line here south of Vostoichenka. They currently have a position just outside Vostoichenka. However, the Ukrainians are still contesting the fortified positions west of Novoselivka. The Russians are looking to secure the southern parts of Vostoichenka before moving on to the next position. And the way they are planning on doing that is getting control over the riverbank to the north and to the south. The Russians have, since February, after the capture of Avdiivka, slowly pushed along the west and north of Avdiivka, steadily expanding their bridgehead across the 2014 line of defense. And this has led to the Russians now moving on to the next area in which they'll have a secure defensive line. The Russians were pushing along Avdiivka towards this river line here to the west, and it has been many months of fighting by now, and the focus has now switched to going beyond that river line, going beyond that defensive line towards Pokrovsk, the highway, and Konstantinivka. And we also see the fighting in New York and Toretsk. Going out and starting in the New York direction, it was reported the Russians actually managed to reach all the way into the western part of the residential area of New York. However, a Ukrainian counterattack managed to push the Russians back outside of it. The Russians are now mainly focused around this railway area here in New York, in the western bank of the river line, where their objective is to get a foothold here in the western parts of it, and then move along the river line to gain control over what's southwest of New York, beyond the river line. We see that there is this apartment complex area. This would be the main target of the Russians. If they manage to gain control of this, they would oversee the road, supply road in and out of New York. This will limit the supply coming in and out of New York from the west. Then they will move on to the industrial area in the central parts of New York. and the residential areas here to the west, gaining full control over the supply road and having their own supplies going here by the riverline on the western bank. After that, we'll also move on to the eastern bank, where they'll gain control over the southern parts. There's also the riverline moving through here. New York is actually split into 3 parts along the riverline. They have one going here to the west and one going here to the east. So they'll be looking to gain control over the western and southern bank of the riverline before moving on to the industrial area. And gaining control over the industrial area would mean that the Russians would have full control over the city. So the entire eastern area will unlikely be focused on. They will likely look to force the Ukrainians to redirect their forces from the east towards the west to hold the lines there, after which they'll take advantage of the lack of Ukrainian soldiers in the east to move in. That is how they usually do. They take advantage of pushing a major push in a weaker area. This will force the Ukrainians to redirect their forces, and then they launch a strong push in the stronger areas, where due to the relocation of Ukrainian troops, they'll be able to take advantage of that and capture parts. We have seen this in the direction of Novoselivka, where the main push came from the south. When they reached the industrial area in the center, they also launched an assault here to the northeast, where they managed to capture all of the fortified positions along the eastern parts of Novoselivka due to the Ukrainians redirecting their forces to the center, where they managed to hold back the Russian advances, yes, but they ended up losing all of their fortified positions to the east. In the direction of Toretsk, we see similar cases of the Russians continuously advancing. We see the main fighting taking place along the apartment complex area. The Russians are taking advantage of the fighting within it to push along the residential area to the east of it, managed to capture the school and some of the apartment complexes in the eastern parts, and they're also pushing through the central parts. So we see heavy fighting is taking place by the apartment complex area. And as I've previously mentioned, that would allow the Russians to secure the first line of defense and start advancing in the direction of the second line of defense. Thus, getting control over the apartment complex area will allow the Russians to have a base on which they can launch assaults on the second line of defense. Combined with the fact that heavy fighting continues in the Druzhba area, where the Russians are looking to gain control over that as well, they'll be able to flank the Ukrainian positions and attack it from 2 directions. So we're currently seeing that the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainian positions along the first line of defense, where they're looking to gain control over the apartment complex area to secure their positions here in between the first and second lines of defense before moving on to the second line of defense. In the direction of Makiivka here further north, we see that the Russians have made a small push towards the village itself. Positional fighting continues along the east of Makiivka as the Russians are slowly advancing along the forest lines, gaining control over one after another, where they're pushing from the northern, eastern and southern parts. The Russians may have gotten positions here very close to the village itself. They're not looking to gain full control of it or a foothold within it until they have aligned the front line along the road. This will allow the Russians to connect the northern, eastern and southern parts together, and that will allow them to make a push to gain a foothold here in the eastern parts, after which they'll look to push across the river line, gain control over the supply line, and then move on to the southern direction to gain full control of the village. We're seeing fighting taking place here in this direction. In a similar relation, here in the direction of Pischane, the Russians have managed to capture the majority of the southern part of the town. This is a sudden push by the Russians, where they managed to capture the southern part along the river line due to the recent assaults in the area, forcing the Ukrainians to fall back to the fortified positions. The Russians took advantage of that to take control of the areas left behind by the Ukrainian soldiers, and now heavy fighting is taking place over these fortified positions that have been isolated from Pischane. This means that there will be no escape for the Ukrainian soldiers that are still left behind in the fortified positions. The Russians here will look to push them down south towards the forest lines and out of the fortified positions, and then gain control over them themselves, leaving the control over the high ground to the Russians, after which they'll be looking to push across the river line, either in the direction of Pischane or strengthening their positions here along Tabaivka and moving along the high ground towards the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Pischane. Therefore, we see direct evidence of the Russians continuing offensive operations here in the direction of Pischane, following positional fighting over the past few days. They've managed to actually make a strong push towards the southern part of the town and are now contesting the fortified positions before they move on to the northern parts. So we see heavy fighting taking place all throughout the eastern parts of the front line here in the Donetsk and Luhansk-Kharkiv region. We also see the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations here in the north, where they're looking to completely push out the Russians from the Kharkiv direction. Here they've expanded their zone of control north of the Vovcha river line, gaining control over the eastern outskirts of Vovchansk and now having full control over the eastern parts of Vovchansk completely. At the same time, we see positional fighting along the northeastern parts by the cemetery, and in the central parts by the citadel area, and in the south by the aggregate plant. So we see heavy fighting all throughout the Vovchansk direction. The Russians were pushed out of these areas, but in anticipation of the current situation, because it was all planned really by the Russians. And I'm not saying that to be overly optimistic for the Russian side. It is simply that they made a lot of fortified positions along the high grounds here to the north, which is clearly indicative of the fact that the Russians would give up these positions to move back to the fortified positions that they've newly created. This is at the high grounds. This means it overlooks the entire town of Vovchansk, and at the same time they have fortified positions. That means that they are safer there than within the town itself. Also closer to the Russian border and further from the Ukrainian positions, meaning that they have better artillery support. So generally their positions here are very safe and powerful, and the Ukrainians would have a difficult time flanking the Russian positions to the east. This means that the Ukrainians have to push through the town of Vovchansk itself if they want to regain control of it. They cannot outflank the Russian positions due to the newly built fortified positions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.